The words are his work is
Go right ahead with your coffee. All right, if we may have your attention. Coming back to Wellhausenism, we've seen the anthropocentric view of the world, the universe. We've seen the evolutionary concept permeating his thinking, and the view that all religion is ultimately a matter of subjective feeling. Well, men didn't buy this immediately. They saw that their Old Testaments became filled with difficulty. Some men immediately abandoned the study of the Old Testament altogether. Well, when men approached Wellhausen and asked him why this differed so much from the formerly held position, he tried to rid himself of any onus of bringing in something entirely new and divergent. He said, well, you just have to realize that the people of Israel are no different than any other nation. Their idea of God evolved through the centuries just as we see it in other cultures. But isn't there, Dr. Wellhausen, a claim in the Old Testament that God did something for this people in a special way, in a revelatory way, in an intervening, interposing way that he didn't do for any other nation? Well, it does state that, but that's a rewriting of the facts, of the accounts, of the records. That is a later theory that has come in to give semblance to what may have been an altogether different set of circumstances in the first place. They are on the same level as all the others. They go, for instance, from totemism to animism to polydemonism to polytheism to henotheism and finally to monotheism. You get it in the 8th century prophets. How do they do it? Well, how could you explain, for instance, the genius of a Shakespeare over against somebody who's just writing some ridiculous verse on the sidewalk or on some wall of a barn, you see? No, this just account for it on the basis of native ability. Now, what were the weaknesses of this Wellhausen school? And it's very important that we realize this, because if you want to maintain the traditional position, you ought to see that it has ample ground and foundation to place under your feet. It isn't that this theory wore well into the 20th century, because before the first quarter of this century was gone, men were declaring publicly that the old line Wellhausenists were to be found only among the older generation, and that there were people holding it now with many, many reservations. The difficulty with that is, friends, that those reservations that many have, and they do still have a lot of reservation, the trouble is that these reservations have somehow had a tremendous lifespan. The longevity has been phenomenal. And as I say then, you can't even get a book that's just come out this year or the latter part of last year on Old Testament or New Testament reduction, but what has this system in it. Well, where were the weaknesses? In the area of the history of culture, in the area of the history of religion, in the area of the history of literature. Culture, history of culture, how civilization began, religion, the manner in which religion developed, and the matter of literature. In these three areas, Wellhausenism showed its weaknesses. Wellhausen was giving his material from very poor presuppositions and from very poor bases. What were his weaknesses, the weaknesses in this Wellhausen system, in the area of the history of culture? He thought, Wellhausen did, in the history of culture, in the area of civilization, that when men talked of the people of Israel, they were dealing with a very ancient people. And that was inherited from the general opinion of the times. Didn't have archaeological light to throw on it from the 2nd and 3rd millennium BC. So in the written documents of the time, when they talked about ancient world, they were dealing with the history of Egypt from Manetho, M-A-N-E-T-H-O, is the reputable historian of Egypt who divided the whole Egyptian history into 30 dynasties. Manetho, he lived about 270 BC. What Wellhausen knew is what he saw in Berosus, along with Manetho. Berosus, B-E-R-O-S, sometimes spelled S-S-U-S, he's about 300 BC. Also, he is the recognized historian of Babylon. So he was going on the basis of what was in the records of Manetho, Berosus, and Josephus. Josephus was 1st century AD, a Jewish historian. And then Eusebius, E-U-S-E-B-I-U-S. Principally these four, well, Herodotus too will bring out 5th century. You have Manetho, 3rd century BC, Berosus, or MLS, you have Josephus, you have Eusebius in his Ecclesiasticae Historia, History of the Church. Eusebius was the Bishop of Caesarea in the Holy Land, in Palestine. Now, Herodotus, I said 5th century BC, he should be there too. Manetho and Berosus, Josephus, Eusebius, and Herodotus. Now, what do you find when you deal with these historians alone concerning the ancient Near Eastern world? You find, friends, and let's not fault them too much because of the age in which they were living, they had no inkling of the great civilizations that had come, flourished, and gone in Western Asia before ever Abraham came on the scene of history. A long time before Abraham. If you don't catch that, then all of the historical materials, ancient history, archaeological history, all that can mean nothing. And the Bible, just because Genesis 12 talks about Abraham, and Adam is in Genesis 1 and 2, and you only have it 10 chapters away, doesn't mean that it happened, just say, a decade before. There were centuries before, even millennia. So they assume then that Israel is a late nation. For instance, when it came to Rome, they think that the history of Rome began with the capture of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC. Well, that's wrong. The efflorescence, the great power of Rome, comes later. But the origin of Rome is long before 390 BC. Suppose somebody said that the United States of America really came into being, say, after World War II. No, it only came into its greatest supremacy and superiority and power then. But we've been in existence since the Pilgrims, you see. You have to differentiate. That's a very important item that even some learned writers overlook, that you can have a nation long before it reaches its apex of power. Now the Greeks attained a great element, an area of power in the 4th century BC under Alexandria. Alexander the Great. He spread all Greek culture throughout the world. But we know that Greek history begins before that, even before the great lawgiver Solon and before that, about 600 BC, and so on. We know there were Greek colonies that had contact with Canaan in the middle of the 2nd century BC. That's how some of the instruments in the book of Daniel have Greek names. Instruments carry the names from the place where they come. Well, balalaika, that's a Russian instrument, carries that name there, you see. And you can even tell it in numerous other ways. Why do you have the man who drives a car called a chauffeur? That's a French word, because the French did the early research in that, you see. And so you could go on in those areas. And you know also in science, in certain theories and certain rays, Röntgen rays and so on, they have the names of the men who worked on those things. They carry them along with them. The Avogadro hypothesis and so on. And you have, what was it, the James Lange theory and so on. All right, what are we saying? Assuming, not knowing all of the facts, your perspective is wrong. You don't know how, if you don't know how far how many cars there are in the train, if you count from the engine 1, 2, 3, you don't know whether you're in the middle of the train or you're just in the first half of the train. You see, you don't see it all in proper perspective. That's the same way with history. And you must always watch in history that you don't do what I illustrate often as like a drape. There's just so much in this partition. If I push it all in one place there, then I don't have anything to cover here. Do you notice? Whereas if I pull it this way and have it uniformly, then it covers all of it. And you have to watch that in chronology too. Very, very important in the matter of chronology. If you have too many events pounded together, then what were folk doing the rest of the time? Just sitting around so that the clock would run out? See? No. No, you can't do that. And that's very important in your chronologies in Judges, for instance, the book of Judges, and others, a New Testament chronology as well. So when Israel appears in Canaan, it seemed to be a very old phase. If you're taking Rome as ancient and Greece as ancient, man alive, Abraham's way beyond that. Must have been a very, very ancient history. That's wrong. They have the history of culture all wrong. Other mistaken notions that grew out of these propositions or presuppositions or presumptions were that ancient peoples had no contact with one another. So if you find in the 14th chapter of Genesis that kings of the Mesopotamia invade the kings of Canaan, that couldn't have happened. In fact, no less a scholar than the great Neldeke, Theodor Neldeke, tremendous linguist. In 1869, he described Genesis 14 as blows unmöglich, just simply impossible, and unhistorical. You see, if your people are ancient, they don't have any contact, there's no widespread commerce, there's no building up of world empires, there are no great military campaigns, all that has to be put later. You can't give it to Abraham because he's too old. You can't have Abraham a monotheist because you're not allowed to have, he's too far back there. Well, how far back? There are all kinds of religious ideas, centuries before Abraham. Yes, Wellhausen talks about simply impossibilities as well as Neldeke on unhistorical. Another presupposition was that no worthy literature existed before Herodotus, 5th century BC. Even the historiography, the writing of contemporary history, was an invention of the Greeks. Art of writing was late, and so on. Archaeology has shown all these views to be wrong. Now, you say archaeology wasn't yet in its bloom, no, but then viewing from insufficient data, you come out wrong, If you have a wrong premise, the only way to come out in a right conclusion is to reason illogically. If you start wrong, you start on a wrong premise, you've got to come out to a wrong conclusion. If you put barley in the hopper, you're going to get barley out. That's all there is to it. If you reason logically. Then there were weaknesses in the field of the history of religion. In the history of religion. What is the view of Bellhouse? That all religion must develop, and you can read this in Interpreter's Bible, Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, all the latest works. You get any commentary from Abingdon Cokesbury, and you find this interwoven, warp and woof. You can't disentangle it. You won't have anything left. It's all interwoven with their position. You have to go in the history of religion from the rudimentary, from the very elementary, from the basic, from the primitive, even childlike, and man is going onward and upward forever, trying to get out of the misery of this life. All right, where was the weakness? Well, number one, they felt justified because of the supposed antiquity of Israel. To put the starting point of the religion as late as possible. If you do find things in the Old Testament that don't sound like things you find in pagan nations, it's because Israel did have that somewhere back there, and there are little straws in the wind, but they grew out of it, and a long period of time elapsed. That's why you got to put Abraham far enough away so that you can have some kind of a prophetic element even in Exodus, where Moses tells you not to kill someone else. That's a high grade, yes, of development. You've got to go first by animism and fetishism and totemism, ancestor worship, all the way through. They're not unlike any of these other peoples. And you remember the prophet Ezekiel says in his condemnation of the nations, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, ye have said that Israel is like unto the other nations. Now, why did God take such umbrage at that? Because God meant them to be different. That is a denial of the purpose of God in redemptive history, to say that they're exactly the same as others. Not because of any inherent worth in them, no, but because you're denying the validity of God's purpose in the world. Therefore, if religion has to go on and develop a long way, you never have the ethical first. Man isn't interested in ethics. He first is interested in external things. He can't see the high ethical, prophetic values. Of course, you find the Decalogue. This is an embarrassment. You find the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, way there early in Exodus 20 with Moses, stressing moral in religion, not even coveting anything that belongs to your neighbor, even inanimate objects as well as animate, anything that belongs to, well, then it can't be Mosaic, obviously. It must come later. It's a rereading. It's what the Germans call a Rückbildung, a retrojection. Many people think the stories about George Washington and the cherry tree. They say that's bound to be projection into the past. It might have been any other kind of tree, or it may never happen like that anyhow. You get up to a certain place where a nation has grown in a way that you never expected them to succeed. Nothing succeeds like success. And then you have to sort of go back and sort of reshape and refashion your poor relatives, your poor ancestors. And that happens in Israel. Here is this beautiful age of Solomon. Queen of Sheba even comes from the end of the unknown world, and she is amazed that she had no more spirit left in her. The props knocked out from under her. She says the half was not told. Well, then don't you see a nation that gets proud of itself like that and begins to keep its historical records? They're going to try to embellish them some. Not that these men lied, they just adorned the truth. They just embellished the truth. So religion in all its forms is a product of the human mind. There's a direct trend onward and upward. Well, ultimately the religious genius, and no one explains genius, it just happens. Under the religious genius of the prophets, you get finally what? Ethical monotheism. A one God who is interested in conduct. Now, in the second place, anthropocentric view of religion has another consequence. It renders impossible the fact of revelation. If man is so self-sufficient, so self-competent, and so self-determining, why does he need anybody anyhow? No, the fact of revelation is ruled out. Well, isn't revelation, the word of the Lord came, isn't that mentioned in so many places? Well, it's just a form of speech. It's just the imagery, the trappings. It's just a stylistic element. It just means law and order that pervade history. And listen to Keenan, Abraham Keenan was a Dutch colleague of Julius Wellhausen. In fact, the theory is sometimes called the Graf Keenan-Wellhausen view. Keenan says this. Listen to this statement. So long as we attribute a part of Israel's religious life directly to God, well, that's forbidden. This is strictly forbidden. And allow supernatural or immediate revelation to intervene even in one instance, just so long does our view of the whole remain inexact, and we see ourselves obliged to do violence here or there to the well-assured content of the historical accounts. And here's the punchline. It is only the assumption of a natural development that takes account of all the phenomena. Just like the moon is made out of green cheese. Revelation and miracle are inseparable, according to the Bible. And the existence of a miracle, for them, marks the account as unhistorical. Well, then where are you going to end? There's no end to it. You have denuded, you have emasculated the record of all miracle. You don't have a whole Bible, you have a Bible full of holes. What about those miracles at Sinai, surrounding the giving of the law, the ratification of the covenant between God and Israel? Wellhausen is able to take it in stride. He says it's the trappings of a dramatic style. And say they, the only people who will believe that are those who venerate a gross supernaturalism. They're just nothing but legendary exaggerations. It's like the little boy that said, I didn't know that was a huge St. Bernard, I thought it was a lion. I thought it was a lion. No. He said, well, how could you? And he said, I suppose Daniel would have thought it was one too, right in front of my home, you see. He said, it's legendary things, you see. All right, then the third of the weaknesses in the area of the history of literature. And here they are more sanguine than we would have expected men who are learned and who know how to scrutinize ancient documents. What is the weakness here? The Wellhausen school assumed that by a literary sifting process, you can ultimately determine the underlying given writer or source, documentary source, of any given portion of the Pentateuch. I repeat, these scholars assume, of the Wellhausen school, that by a literary sifting process, you could get at the underlying sources of any given writer in any part of the Pentateuch. Now, we don't believe necessarily that Moses had to have a revelation of everything that happened in Genesis. We know he wasn't living in that time, but he could have had it from one or two sources, either oral or written. We'll go for even the written sources, since we find in the Pentateuch, they say in the book of Jasher and so on. Remember that feature of canonicity? It's not antiquity. There's some books that were still older. Now, we'll go for that. But where we do call a halt is by saying that you can pull out this strand and say, here's this one writer, and here is this another writer. In fact, the Polychrome Bible did it. That's the meaning of it, many colors. They had a red color, like you see some folk, this color's supposed to be for salvation, this for green for works, and this gold for glory and all right. But you understand that's just a study method. But these folk say they can, in this method, show that this was writer so-and-so, and writer so-and-so, until you have a practical alphabet soup, J-E-P-D. And you get a man like Pfeiffer of Harvard, and he wants an S document in the Pentateuch. S for south, for Edom. Since when? Because there's a statement about the Temanites being wise. But over against that, there are many passages to show they're stupid enough not to have known the will of God and to have come in for condign punishment from the Lord. No. These sources are not only incapable of being separated
as distinct strands, they are not capable, they're not susceptible of chronological arrangement on the basis of superimposed criteria. Let's say, well, this writer always talks in a sort of a general way. This writer always talks in a vivid, dramatic style. This one is always interested in genealogies. This one's always in historical data. And he's always like a grocery list, you know, so-and-so begat so-and-so and so on, like Genesis 5, or portions of Chronicles and so on. You have that same kind of a writing that levels all the way through a J writer or an E writer and so on. Well, the bias of an investigator influences his work on this. You cannot find the formation of these books in this fashion. Now, how did we get, and this will hold over even for New Testament studies, how did we get these from, say, Moses' hand down to our hand? Well, the original manuscripts are called the autographa, from two Greek words. The writer himself writing it, it's his own writing, or autographs. Autographer, or autographs, their own writing. They're not quite so numerous as the New Testament manuscripts, and much less difference among them, because of the extreme care with which they were transcribed. They had to be handed down over a much longer period of time, for one thing. There are two different types of Hebrew manuscripts, those that were used for synagogue and those for private persons. The earliest manuscripts we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls, from about, 200 BC, some are holding now, 150 to 200 BC. Into the 3rd century, into the 2nd century BC. Now, you have these manuscripts. Moses writes it, the direction of the Spirit of God. Isaiah writes his. Hosea writes his. Now, in time, after these were circulated among the people, and we know they were, read this among my disciples, says Isaiah in the 8th chapter. The unlearned says, how can I? And so forth. They were circulated. Then in the time of, follow me, Nehemiah 8, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, remember we had that time of the formulation, the collection of the canon, we have these manuscripts. Now they've been copied. They've been copied. And we indicate, we have every indication that they were copied with unusual faithfulness. It's a standing marvel of the day. For instance, you heard so many folks say, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that discovery is going to revolutionize our view of the Old Testament. No, even a liberal like Muller Burroughs of the Department of Biblical Theology, now retired from Yale University, said, if I were arguing, he has this in beginning one of his chapters in his books on More Light on the Dead Sea Scrolls, he said, if I were, God forbid, and he puts the words God forbid in, if I were arguing with a professor of Moody Bible Institute and one from Fordham University, a fundamentalist, Protestant, and a Catholic, he said, I could not, listen to him, I could not turn to one sentence in the Dead Sea Scrolls to maintain any position I took over against theirs. He comes to the ultimate conclusion, he was there when they were found over in the state of Israel and over in the Holy Land. He said, I might bold to say, and he's repeated it more than once, that no doctrine of the Old or New Testament, no position has been invalidated by anything that's been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's right. For instance, in our latest original text of Isaiah, they have one area where you have versions, translations of the Old Testament. Under that you have conjectures for the most part. Then there is a third paragraph in thinner Hebrew type. Now what's that? At the bottom of the first chapter of Isaiah it says, these are readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls found at the Dead Sea in 1947. These are from those manuscripts copyrighted by the American Schools of Oriental Research. It gives Miller Burns and so on. Now, as you look through that, you're just amazed at how anybody could say they have any real validity or any great consequence. For instance, it's like most of them are orthographic, just spelling, like spelling though, T-H-O instead of T-H-O-U-G-H, or through, T-H-R-U instead of T-H-R-O-U-G-H, or night, N-I-T-E instead of N-I-G-H-T. It's just orthographic. For instance, the verse says, the ox knows his owner, and they ask his master's crib, Israel does not know, my people does not consider. All they added there was, Israel does not know, and added a conjunction which is put onto the word, a wow, and my people. My, that's earth-shaking. Earth-shaking. And straight on down the line. Now, I don't want to mislead you. There are some places where the text has a bit more light on that, but never of great weight or touching any doctrinal position of the Bible. No formulaic theology is endangered by it. So what happened then? Here are these manuscripts. They copied a long time, and if you realize, and this we have in the Talmud, rules for it. They even had what kind of parchment it was to be on, what kind of ink. If 3 mistakes were made in one, it was pasul. You had to throw it away. Well, because it had the name of God. When I say throw it away, they wouldn't throw anything away that had the name of God on it. In fact, today, it was in LA Times some years ago, there was a box gotten together of old prayer books and old scrolls from the synagogue, and they buried it just like a human being. You're not allowed to throw anything away that has the name of God on it. That's why some of these genizas, some of these things that were held in the lumber rooms of the synagogues have been found, like in Ecclesiasticus was found down there in Cairo, Egypt. So my point is they took untold pains to see that they copied it correctly. Now, then you remember you have these versions that we talked about, into Greek, into Aramaic, into Syriac, into Latin. Then you have editions and printed copies of the Scripture. Now, our question here is, and we have time enough just to conclude it, the question here is, seeing we have manuscripts, seeing we have versions, seeing we have quotations in the Church Fathers, remember we talked about quotations, some of them claiming that made the Apocrypha valid. And by the way, don't think that's just a little snitch. Now look at a promise. Oh no, if you read the Ante-Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, you can get a great quantity. I'd be afraid to say you'd have every verse in the Bible, but you have great quantities of biblical material quoted there. And same in the Talmud. Now, with the manuscripts, follow me, with the versions, with the quotations, and the printed editions that have come down now, how faithfully would you say we have the original text of the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek? How faithfully would you say that has been transmitted to us? I'll talk mostly on the angle of the Old Testament because the New Testament has so much less lengthy a history. You see, the Old Testament goes from about 15th century BC with Moses until Malachi and up to the New Testament. The New Testament was all done in 1 century. The New Testament came into being all in 1 century. What measures were taken to preserve the text from corruption and mutilation? Well, we mentioned what they were. Severe rules that must be adhered to. How far back can we trace our present text? Well, I think, students, the best way to get it clarified in our minds would be to take it in 4 periods. The first period on the history of the text would be from the end of inspiration. It would extend to the end of inspiration, and the collection of the canon under Ezra and Nehemiah. That's your first period. Very important period, and I don't think even our most liberal scholars can deny us that. They probably would say it would extend from the writing, they wouldn't say cessation of inspiration, extending to that time. They would just say from the time of the writing till the last book was written, probably that way. We say it extends from the time of the inspiration to the end of inspiration with Malachi and the collection of the canon under Ezra and Nehemiah. The second period is the period of the scribes. What did Ezra and his guild of scribes do? And I should say, I have met men who were called Sopharim in modern Judaism, and they are learned men. They are men with one passion: to transmit as faithfully, as accurately, as unerringly as they can the text. That's their life ambition. Period of the scribes. Then the period of men who are called Masoretes. There's more than one way of spelling this, but this is an accepted word. Masoretes, it comes from the Hebrew word masorah, those who pass on the tradition. That's the third period. I'll give you the dates on these. The Masoretes. And the last is the post. What we call the post-Masoretic period. Sometimes spelled Masoretic, E-T, Masorah. The period up to Ezra Nehemiah, from the writing to Ezra Nehemiah. Then it's collected there, you see, there's Nehemiah. Then the period of the scribes, what Ezra did. And we have these scribes in the Gospels, you see. It became a guild, organization, a well-knit union. One objective in mind. They know the letter of the law. Even the Lord Jesus Christ paid them that. He indicated they knew the letter of the law. Paul did too. He indicated it as scribes. Then the Masoretic period, and then the post-Masoretic. All right, what goes in the first? Well, we have the citations. We mentioned them last time from the Old Testament about the preservation of the revelation. Keep this law in the ark. Keep a book of the law so that a king reads it annually and he knows how to live in accordance with it. Now, we're not denying, folk, we do not believe in the inspiration of scribes, copyists. They can make mistakes, but you always have a way, if you collect enough of these, you can tell where the error came in and how it came in. There are errors of the ear and errors of the eye. Errors can be made by hearing a thing wrong.